Picture this scene, unfolding in brutal slow motion. A wooden peasant club, the kind used to slaughter livestock, arcs through mountain air and shatters a golden visor worth more than a village. A mob of mud-covered men drags a screaming knight from his destrier warhorse, a beast bred for 3 generations to carry armored nobility into battle. They hack at the royal ostrich crest, emblazoned on his breastplate, until the movement stops, until the expensive Italian plate is dented beyond recognition and red with blood. They hold up the bloodied helmet high above their heads, cheering in Romanian dialects, absolutely convinced they have just butchered Charles I, King of Hungary, the most powerful monarch in Central Europe. But 50 yards away, crouched in cold mud behind a dead horse, the real king watches his loyal body double die, screaming his name. Charles Robert of Anjou, descendant of French royalty, ruler of the richest kingdom in the East, wears a common foot soldier's filthy tunic stolen from a corpse. He is trembling uncontrollably, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. Desiderius Hadervari, the loyal knight who volunteered to wear the king's distinctive armor as a decoy, takes the final agonizing blow meant for his monarch. His sacrifice buys Charles maybe 10 minutes to escape. This brutal execution, this reversal of the natural order where peasants murder kings, kicks off the Battle of Posada, November 1330. Before we dive deep into this forgotten massacre that changed Eastern European history, if you're fascinated by the brutal realities behind sanitized history, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles for more content exposing these truths. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different corners of the world, connected across 7 centuries by our shared hunger to understand how the powerless sometimes destroy the powerful. Panic, raw animal terror, defined those 4 November days in the Carpathian Mountains. To understand how a European superpower collapsed into a panicked rabble butchered by shepherds, we must strip away the romantic myth and examine the actual men holding the swords, the political calculations, and the fatal mistakes. Charles Robert of the House of Anjou did not politely ask for power or inherit it peacefully. He took it through systematic violence. He spent the first 2 decades of his reign methodically crushing the Hungarian oligarchs, the so-called little kings who dared defy royal authority and ruled their provinces like independent warlords. He besieged their castles one by one. He seized control of the legendary gold mines at Kremnica and the silver deposits at Chemnitz. He centralized the currency, making every transaction dependent on his royal mint. By 1330, he commanded the most feared heavy cavalry force in Central Europe, perhaps the world. His knights rode destriers, war horses bred specifically for impact, trained for years to charge without flinching. They wore layered mail and plate armor that deflected arrows like rain off metal. Charles looked at the map of Europe spreading before him in his palace at Visegrad and saw a kingdom that bent completely to his will. He believed absolutely in the divine authority of his crown. He had crushed internal dissent. Now he looked south toward easy conquest. Basarab I, the founder of Wallachia, offered a completely different kind of challenge, one Charles's military education had not prepared him to face. Basarab did not meet Hungarian steel with steel in glorious open battle. He met it with silence, patience, and intimate geographic knowledge. While Charles built armies funded by gold mines, Basarab built a trap using mountains. He had unified the local voivodeships, small, semi-independent territories, ruled by chieftains, not through grand parades or displays of wealth, but through absolutely necessary military alliances against the Golden Horde, the Mongol remnant that still terrorized the East. Basarab understood with crystal clarity that his light infantry, armed with hunting bows and farming implements, could never survive a frontal cavalry charge on open plains where Hungarian tactics were designed to function. So he made a strategic decision that would define Wallachian survival for centuries. He refused absolutely to give them that open field. The conflict that would doom 30,000 men started with a simple demand wrapped in royal arrogance. Charles claimed Wallachia as a vassal state owing feudal obligations to the Hungarian crown. He wanted regular taxes paid in silver. He wanted public submission and the humiliation of homage. He wanted the borders secured on his terms, with Wallachia serving as a buffer against Ottoman and Mongol threats. Basarab, understanding the danger of direct refusal, sent diplomatic envoys to Visegrad, carrying offers of peace. He offered substantial gold payments to buy his country's continued independence. He offered hostages, including members of his own family. He was essentially trying to pay ransom for his own nation's freedom, acknowledging Hungarian superiority without actually submitting to it. Charles, sitting on his throne, surrounded by advisors hungry for conquest, spat on the offer with contempt. He viewed negotiation as fundamental weakness. To him, Basarab was not a legitimate ruler deserving respect. He was a shepherd playing dress-up in stolen finery, a peasant who needed to be reminded of his place. The king gathered an overwhelming army of 30,000 men, a massive force by medieval standards, representing perhaps 1% of Hungary's entire population mobilized for war. He brought the full crushing weight of the Hungarian war machine to the southern border. His intention was clear and publicly stated: march through the Carpathian Mountains, burn Basarab's capital at Curtea de Argeș to the ground, install a puppet governor loyal to Hungary, and make an example that would terrify any other would-be independent states. The Chronicon Pictum, the illustrated chronicle of Hungarian history, depicts this march in vivid detail. It shows the knights in perfect geometric formation, banners flying high, sunlight glinting off polished armor, faces confident in their absolute invincibility. They expected a glorious battle, a green field where they could couch their lances in the traditional manner and thunder across the ground, scattering inferior forces like wheat before the scythe. Basarab gave them scorched earth instead. As the massive Hungarian columns pushed deeper into Wallachian territory, covering miles each day, they found only empty villages still smoking from recent fires. The wells they discovered were poisoned with rotting animal carcasses, or deliberately filled with dirt and stones. Granaries that should have held winter grain stores stood completely empty, swept clean. The enemy, the Wallachian forces they had come to destroy, refused to show their faces for honorable combat. Starvation struck the royal army before a single arrow had been fired in anger. The horses, those expensive destriers worth fortunes, grew visibly weaker day by day without proper fodder. The knights, encased in heavy armor, designed for brief combat, not extended marching, sweated profusely in the autumn heat as they trudged through increasingly difficult terrain, chasing a ghost army that left only ashes. Charles realized his catastrophic strategic mistake too late, when retreat became the only option to avoid total disaster. With supplies running critically low and his army on the edge of starvation and mutiny, he ordered a general withdrawal. He turned his long columns toward Transylvania to the north, seeking the safety of Hungarian garrisons there. But geography is unforgiving. The only practical route back to friendly territory lay through a narrow mountain defile, a jagged scar carved by ancient rivers through the Carpathian Range, where the cliffs rose like vertical walls on either side, blocking the sky. Basarab, watching the retreat from the high ridges with his scouts, had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, this specific decision. He had studied Charles, understood his psychology, predicted his choices. He let the Hungarian vanguard pass unmolested into the defile. He let the king himself enter the stone chute. When the bulk of the Hungarian force had squeezed into the narrowest section of the pass, where mounted knights could not turn their horses, and lances could not be lowered without striking the rider ahead, where escape was impossible. Basarab gave the signal. The trap did not just spring shut, it exploded with coordinated violence. To grasp the sheer military insanity of what happened in that mountain pass, the absolute reversal of expected medieval warfare, we must first understand the vast disparity between the combatants. This was not a skirmish between roughly equal forces. This was a collision between a European superpower entering its golden age of prosperity and a barely recognized state that didn't officially exist on most maps. Charles I of Hungary stands as an absolute titan in this comparison. History often calls him Charles Robert, emphasizing his prestigious Anjou lineage, connecting him to French and Italian royalty. When he arrived in Hungary as a young child to claim a disputed throne, the kingdom was a fractured mess of competing powers. Powerful oligarchs, the so-called Little Kings, ruled their provinces like independent fiefdoms, completely ignoring the nominal authority of the crown and terrorizing the peasantry for profit. Charles did not inherit a functioning throne. He had to conquer it systematically, castle by castle, over 20 brutal years. He besieged their fortifications, stripped their titles through legal maneuvering, and centralized absolute power in his own hands through a combination of military force and political cunning. By the 1320s, Charles sat firmly at the helm of a European superpower, with seemingly unlimited resources. The gold mines of Kremnica and the silver mines of Chemnitz flowed precious metals directly into his royal treasury. Hungary supplied a massive percentage of Europe's total gold production, funding a cultural and military renaissance. Charles possessed the financial means to maintain a standing army of professional mercenaries and heavily armored knights, a luxury most medieval kingdoms couldn't afford. He looked at his borders and saw only opportunities for profitable expansion. To the south lay the fragmented Balkans, to the east, the vast steppes. He believed, with justification based on his previous successes, that he had a divine mandate to bring civilized order to these wild frontiers. In his worldview, he was the hammer of Christian civilization pounding barbarians into submission. Then there was Basarab I, and if Charles was the hammer, Basarab was the anvil, quiet, seemingly immovable, forged in shadows and secrecy. The historical record surrounding Basarab is frustratingly sparse and fragmentary, pieced together primarily from the complaints and chronicles of his enemies, who had reason to distort his achievements. He emerges from the political mist of the early 14th century as the voivode of Wallachia, a title claiming leadership over Romanian-speaking peoples between the Carpathians and the Danube. Even his name reveals complex heritage. Basarab likely derives from Cuman or Turkic linguistic origins, suggesting a bloodline tied to the fierce nomadic peoples who had roamed these regions for centuries. Basarab faced a geopolitical nightmare that would have crushed most leaders. To his east, the Golden Horde, the terrifying remnants of the Mongol Empire that had devastated Eastern Europe, still demanded tribute and exerted violent influence. To his north and west loomed Catholic Hungary's endless hunger for expansion and religious conformity. Basarab played a desperately dangerous game of diplomatic balance, acknowledging Hungarian overlordship when absolutely necessary to maintain an uneasy peace, but quietly consolidating his own independent power base. He systematically united the disparate Romanian knyaz, small polities ruled by local chieftains who had never cooperated before, into a functioning coalition. He built this alliance not on wealth or gold, which he lacked, but on shared survival instinct against common existential threats. For Charles, looking south from his comfortable palace, Basarab was just another rebellious little king, functionally identical to the Hungarian oligarchs he had already crushed. He viewed Wallachia not as a sovereign neighbor deserving diplomatic respect, but as a buffer zone, a stretch of wild land that belonged to the Hungarian crown by divine and feudal right. The king referred to Wallachia dismissively as Terra Transalpina, the land beyond the mountains, implying it was merely an untamed extension of his own domain, waiting to be properly civilized. The friction that would kill thousands began when Basarab started acting like an actual sovereign ruler rather than a submissive vassal. He expanded Wallachian territory southward, crossing the Danube to seize the strategic fortress of Severin, a critical gateway controlling both trade routes and military access to the Balkans. He stopped paying the regular tribute Charles demanded as acknowledgement of Hungarian overlordship. In the royal courts of Visegrad, this was far more than mere insolence or tax evasion. This was a fundamental breach of the feudal contract that held medieval society together. Charles took this defiance extremely personally, seeing it as a direct stain on his hard-won legacy of centralizing power. His advisors, eager for land grants and glory, whispered encouragement in his ear. They told him confidently that the Wallachians were primitive, armed with little more than farming tools and hunting bows. They claimed the entire campaign would be a simple police action, over in weeks. Basarab likely knew he was deliberately provoking a giant, understood that defying Charles meant inevitable war. But Basarab also knew something the Hungarian court either ignored or didn't understand: the land itself. He knew that heavy cavalry, the overwhelming pride of the Anjou war machine, absolutely required open plains to function effectively. He knew that in the deep ancient forests and narrow mountain passes of the southern Carpathians, a knight in full plate was just a man trapped in a metal cage, vulnerable and slow. While Charles prepared for what he imagined would be a triumphal parade through the mountains, followed by a coronation ceremony installing a puppet, Basarab prepared the mountains themselves for war, turning geography into weaponry. The war began with a deceptive Hungarian victory that felt too easy. As the massive host approached the border in autumn 1330, their first target was the Banate of Severin, the fortress Basarab had seized. The stronghold fell with barely any resistance, the gates opening after minimal siege. Basarab withdrew his forces without fighting, surrendering the strategic position to Charles and his generals. This confirmed everything they believed about their enemy. The Wallachian shepherd was retreating in terror before superior force. The campaign appeared effectively over before it had truly started. Confident in his absolute dominance, Charles established a temporary royal court in the captured territory, receiving petitions and dispensing justice as if the war was already won. Here, in this moment of premature celebration, a final envoy from Basarab arrived under flag of truce. The message the voivode sent was not a defiant declaration of war, but a desperate, humiliating plea for peace that reveals how much he wanted to avoid this confrontation. The terms Basarab offered were staggering in their submission. He promised to permanently renounce all claims to Severin and return it to Hungarian control. He offered to pay all back taxes he owed to the Hungarian crown, acknowledging Charles as his feudal superior. He pledged to send one of his own sons to the royal court in Visegrad as a permanent hostage, a living guarantee of his future loyalty, whose life would be forfeit if Basarab ever rebelled again. Most shockingly, Basarab offered a direct cash payment of 7,000 marks of silver as immediate compensation for his defiance. To understand the magnitude of this offer, 7,000 marks represented approximately 1.7 tons of pure silver bullion, an absolutely massive sum. In the 14th century economy, this amount could fund a professional army for many months, could build several castles, could ransom multiple captured kings. Basarab was essentially offering to empty his entire treasury, to bankrupt his nascent state, to buy his people's survival with a literal mountain of precious metal. Charles's more experienced advisors and seasoned military commanders looked at this offer and saw obvious wisdom. They saw a complete victory achieved without risking a single Hungarian life. They had regained the disputed territory, would receive an enormous financial injection, and had secured a valuable hostage. Several barons urged the king strongly to accept the deal immediately and return home in triumph to Visegrad. Charles ignored every voice of reason with royal contempt. The Chronicon Pictum records his response with chilling precision, preserving his exact words for history. The king did not merely reject Basarab's offer, he mocked the man who made it with calculated ethnic slurs. He reportedly told the trembling envoys, "Basarab is nothing more than the shepherd of my sheep, and I will personally drag him by his beard from whatever hole he's hiding in." This single sentence, dripping with aristocratic contempt, sealed the fate of 30,000 men. Charles did not want the silver or the land or the hostage. He wanted the man himself, wanted personal submission, wanted to humiliate Basarab publicly to make an example. The reference to Basarab as a shepherd was a calculated ethnic and class slur, dismissing the voivode's claims to royal status and reducing him to a dirty peasant tending animals in a cave. The threat to drag him by the beard was an assertion of physical dominance, the kind of language a brutal master uses on a rebellious serf who needs punishment. Driven by this personal vendetta rather than strategic calculation, Charles ordered his army to press forward immediately. He aimed for Kurti de Argesh, Basarab's capital, hidden deep in the mountains. The king genuinely believed he was hunting a fleeing, terrified animal. He commanded his knights to mount their war horses, leaving the safety of the captured fortress and their supply lines behind. They marched south, away from reinforcements, away from the open plains where their tactics worked, straight into the dense ancient forests of the southern Carpathians. The easy victory at Severin had acted as perfect bait. Now, having refused the silver and publicly insulted his enemy with racial contempt, Charles walked willingly toward the sharpened hook. The time for diplomacy and peaceful resolution had ended completely. The time for the shepherd to demonstrate to the civilized king what happens when you underestimate those you consider beneath you was about to begin. Charles led his massive army into what soldiers would later describe as a green hell. As the Hungarian columns pushed deeper into the Carpathian foothills, covering difficult miles each day, the roads dissolved into treacherous mud tracks. The dense forest canopy blocked out the sun, creating perpetual twilight even at midday. But the true enemy was not the difficult terrain or the oppressive atmosphere, it was the eerie, unnatural silence. Basarab had systematically stripped the land to bare bone. Every village the Hungarians reached was a smoking ruin, still warm from recent burning. The granaries were swept completely clean, not a single grain of wheat or barley remaining. Wells were deliberately filled with rotting animal carcasses or poisoned with decomposing matter, making the water undrinkable. The shepherd had moved his entire population like a flock, herding them into the mountains, leaving absolutely nothing behind but ashes and despair. This was the scorched earth strategy executed with ruthless, methodical efficiency. Days turned into weeks of fruitless marching. The immense baggage train, designed to carry plunder and supplies back to Hungary, became crushing dead weight, slowing the entire army. The 30,000 men, expecting quick victory and rich spoils, began to genuinely starve. The Chronicon Pictum does not shy away from depicting the growing misery. It describes armored knights, men worth their weight in silver and gold, reduced to desperately digging in the forest floor for edible roots like common peasants. The strict hierarchy of feudal military society began to visibly break down when the food rations ran out completely. Soldiers looked at their prized destriers, horses that had been bred for 3 generations specifically for warfare, trained for years at enormous expense, and saw only their next meal. They began slaughtering the very animals they depended on for combat capability just to survive another day of starvation. Some accounts suggest they boiled their leather saddles and boots to gnaw on the softened hide for whatever nutrition it might provide. Disease followed close behind famine, as it always does. Dysentery tore through the camp, weakening men already fainting from hunger, turning the army into a slow-moving column of the sick. Throughout this slow-motion collapse of military effectiveness and morale, the Wallachians remained completely invisible, refusing every attempt at engagement. Basarab absolutely refused to give Charles the set-piece battle he desperately craved, the open-field combat where Hungarian tactics were designed to dominate. He simply let the ancient forest do the killing for him. Occasional arrow fire would suddenly erupt from the distant tree line, striking a straggler or an isolated scout. But by the time the Hungarian heavy cavalry wheeled their horses around to charge toward the threat, the attackers had already vanished completely into the mist and undergrowth like ghosts. Paranoia set in among the exhausted, starving soldiers. The great conquering army was fighting a phantom enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, couldn't even locate to surrender to. By the time they reached the approximate vicinity of Curtea de Argeș, Basarab's capital, the city was either completely abandoned or too heavily fortified to assault with a starving, diseased force. Charles faced a humiliating reality that contradicted everything his advisors had promised. His supposedly invincible army was dissolving not from glorious combat, but from simple logistics and geography. He had dragged 30,000 men into a wilderness wasteland, and now he had to extract them before they died of starvation or disease. With winter rapidly approaching and his supplies completely exhausted, the king made the only choice remaining. He ordered a general retreat back to Hungarian territory. But he did not return via the route he had used for the invasion, perhaps seeking a faster route home, or perhaps because the original path was now completely impassable with autumn mud. Charles turned his forces toward Transylvania via a different mountain route. He aimed for a specific pass his scouts had identified. The king believed the danger was over, that the worst was behind them. In his mind, the campaign was a political failure and personal embarrassment, but not a military disaster. He was simply marching his army home to regroup, rebuild, and perhaps try again in spring with better preparation. He had absolutely no idea that Basarab had anticipated this specific route with uncanny accuracy. The Wallachians were not retreating or celebrating. They were racing ahead of the Hungarian column, climbing the high ridges on either side of the pass, systematically piling loose stones, felling trees to create barricades, and preparing arrows. Charles was not leading his men to safety in warm beds. He was leading them directly into the most perfect kill zone in medieval military history. The exact geographic location where the Hungarian army marched to its doom remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Romanian historiography, debated by scholars for 7 centuries. The name Posada itself is not a specific town marked on medieval maps. It derives from a Slavic root word, meaning passage or defile, describing a type of terrain rather than a fixed location. Historians have spent generations debating the true site of the massacre. Some scholars point confidently to the Lăpușna Valley based on geographical analysis. Others argue passionately for the Mehadia region or the Bran Pass based on archaeological evidence and local legends. But while the precise coordinates remain frustratingly uncertain, the fundamental geography is absolutely undeniable and consistent across all sources. Basarab deliberately chose a location where the mountains themselves acted as a mechanical vice, crushing anything caught between them. As the long, strung-out Hungarian column entered the narrow defile, exhausted and focused only on getting home, the world began to physically shrink around them. The path was barely wide enough for 3 horses to ride abreast, forcing the column to stretch out for miles. On one side, a sheer drop into a deep ravine, or a rushing river hundreds of feet below. On the other side, steep forest-covered cliffs rising vertically hundreds of feet into gray autumn sky. The peaks hidden in low clouds, the heavy cavalry, the absolute pride of Charles's military machine, instantly became a massive liability rather than an asset. In an open field, a fully armored knight on a charging destrier is essentially a medieval tank, unstoppable. In a narrow gorge where movement is restricted, he becomes just expensive traffic, a metal obstacle blocking everyone behind him. The Hungarian formation stretched out for miles, becoming a thin, vulnerable snake of metal and flesh winding through the rocks, unable to see its own tail. Communication between the vanguard and rearguard became completely impossible across the distance. The king, riding somewhere in the middle of this massive column, was functionally blind to what lay ahead or behind him. The Wallachians had prepared the killing ground with sadistic precision and infinite patience. High above on the ridges, hidden by dense fir trees and the perpetual mountain mist, thousands of peasants waited in complete silence. They had spent days carefully loosening massive boulders from their ancient positions. They had piled trunks of fallen trees at the very edge of the precipice, ready to push. They had cut and fletched thousands of arrows, and most importantly, they had constructed a massive wall. As the Hungarian vanguard rounded a sharp bend in the deepest, narrowest section of the gorge, they stopped abruptly. A massive barricade of earth, timber, and stones completely blocked the path forward, too high to climb, too solid to quickly dismantle. The commanders at the front shouted urgent orders back down the line to clear the obstacle, but the structure was professionally constructed and incredibly solid. Confusion rippled down the entire column like a wave. Men at the front shouted to move forward and begin clearing. Men in the middle, unable to see the problem, shouted to find out what was happening. Men at the rear, still entering the defile, shouted to keep moving. The entire column ground to a complete halt, horses and men packed shoulder to shoulder. It was the textbook bottleneck scenario, taught in every military academy, examining medieval ambush tactics, an enemy force compressed into an impossibly tight space with no room to maneuver. The Hungarians were catastrophically compressed. Horses, sensing the rising anxiety of their riders and the unnatural closeness of other animals, began to panic, jostling nervously against one another. The knights were trapped in their saddles, unable to dismount in the dangerous crush of bodies, unable to turn their horses around, unable to lift their lances without striking the rider directly ahead. The silence in the gorge must have been absolutely terrifying, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums before a thunderstorm. 30,000 men, frozen in a stone corridor barely wider than a street, waiting. They looked up nervously at the steep vertical walls of the ravine towering above them. They saw nothing but dark trees and gray fog. No movement, no sound, just oppressive silence. Then, a signal echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing and multiplying. It might have been a horn blast, a shouted command, or simply the grinding sound of the first massive boulder tipping over the edge of the cliff. The trap, set with the patience of a hunter waiting for deer, finally snapped shut with mechanical precision. The geography of the Carpathian Mountains had done the work of capturing and immobilizing the king's forces. Now gravity would do the work of killing them. The sky fell. That is the only adequate description for the opening moments of the ambush. The only phrase that captures the sudden transformation from uneasy silence to absolute chaos. The Wallachians did not begin their assault with a dramatic war cry or a horn blast giving warning. They began with physics, with the oldest weapon in human history. From the high ridges, invisible hands levered massive boulders over the edge, stones that had sat in those positions for millennia. These rocks, gathering terrifying speed as they careened and bounced down the steep slopes, smashed into the packed column of immobilized knights below with the destructive force of siege engines, of catapults. The Chronicon Pictum captures this horror in vivid illustrated detail that still shocks modern viewers. It shows Wallachian peasants in simple clothing standing safely on the high cliffs, using long poles and levers to roll enormous rocks and massive tree trunks down upon the Hungarians trapped below like animals in a pen. The physical effect was absolutely catastrophic. War horses were crushed instantly, their bones shattered, their bodies pulverized. Knights encased in expensive plate armor and chainmail that had cost fortunes were flattened in their saddles, the metal that made them invincible on plains, becoming metal coffins. The armor could stop a sword or an arrow. It crumpled like thin foil under the weight of falling granite weighing hundreds of pounds. Panic rippled through the gorge, faster than the arrows that followed, spreading like fire through dry grass. The horses, terrified by the thunderous noise of impacts and the overwhelming smell of blood and crushed flesh, began to thrash wildly in their confined space. They kicked with their powerful rear legs, trampling their own riders who had fallen. They reared up, smashing into the horses and men packed around them. The narrow path transformed into a mechanical meat grinder. Those who weren't directly crushed by falling rocks were trampled to death by their panicked comrades and animals. Then came the arrows, thousands of them. The Wallachian archers, positioned high above the chaos on both sides of the ravine, rained death down into the trapped pit below. They didn't need to carefully aim for specific vulnerable targets. The Hungarians were packed so impossibly tight that every single arrow found flesh, a neck, a gap in the armor at the armpit, or the unprotected flank of a horse. The air filled with the sickening repeated thud of bodkin-pointed arrows piercing flesh and the high-pitched screams of wounded animals and dying men. Down in the defile, the Hungarian commanders tried desperately to rally their forces and impose some kind of order. They shouted themselves hoarse, giving orders to form a protective shield wall, to dismount and charge up the slopes on foot, to do anything to fight back. But orders were completely useless in the absolute cacophony of screaming men, dying horses, and falling rocks. The steep canyon walls were functionally unclimbable for men wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons. Those, desperate or brave enough to try, clawing at the mud and exposed roots with their gauntleted hands, were easily picked off by the peasants waiting above, or simply lost their footing on the slick surface and tumbled back down into the crush of bodies below. The slaughter continued relentlessly as the sun moved across the sky. When the sun finally set, plunging the gorge into complete darkness, the killing did not stop. The Wallachians knew this terrain intimately, had grown up in these mountains. They continued to harass the trapped army throughout the long night with arrows and rocks. The Hungarians could not sleep, could not rest, could not even sit down in the crush of bodies. They could not light fires for warmth or cooking for fear of making themselves perfect targets. They stood in the cold mud, surrounded by the constant groans and screams of the dying, flinching at every sound, waiting helplessly for the next rock to fall from the invisible darkness above. By the second day, as gray dawn light filtered weakly into the gorge, the ravine floor was literally paved with bodies and the corpses of horses. The surviving knights were physically and mentally exhausted, severely dehydrated, and psychologically broken beyond repair. The distinct advantage of the flower of chivalry, their expensive training since childhood, their iron discipline, their superior equipment had been completely nullified by geography and gravity. A Wallachian peasant with a rock on a cliff was now objectively superior to a Hungarian duke with a sword trapped in a ditch. Basarab's strategic plan was working with terrifying efficiency, exceeding even his expectations. This wasn't a battle in any traditional sense, it was a systematic extermination, a culling. The Wallachians did not need to engage in risky hand-to-hand combat where Hungarian training might matter. They simply maintained control of the high ground and let the physics of the ambush do the work for them. For the Hungarians trapped below, there was no enemy to strike back at in revenge, no target for their fury and fear. There was only the vertical wall of the mountain and the continuous rain of death from above. The King of Hungary, the most powerful man in Central Europe, the heir to French royalty, sat amidst this growing carnage, watching his grand imperial ambitions literally turn into piles of broken bones and twisted expensive metal. And the worst part, The detail that must have broken his spirit, the trap had only just begun. He would be trapped here for 4 days. By the 3rd day of continuous assault, the very concept of an organized army ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The gorge had become an open-air tomb. The survivors, those who hadn't been crushed or pierced, were no longer fighting for the glory of the Anjou dynasty or Hungarian imperial expansion. They were desperately clawing over the bodies of their dead friends just to find space to breathe. The stench of 3 days of death, thousands of corpses confined within narrow stone walls with no wind, was physically suffocating, making men vomit inside their helmets. Charles I, the man who had dreamed of uniting Eastern Europe under his enlightened banner, now faced a stark existential reality. He was going to die here, in this ditch, forgotten. The arrows were getting closer to his position, the archers adjusting their aim. The chants from the cliffs grew louder and more triumphant. The Wallachians were no longer content with simply dropping rocks from safety. They were preparing to descend into the gorge and finish the work with knives. In this moment of absolute terror and certain death, the king made a decision that would haunt his legacy and raise questions about his character for centuries. He summoned one of his most loyal commanders, Desiderius Hedervari, universally known in the Chronicles as Desh. The king stripped off his distinctive royal surcoat emblazoned with the golden ostrich symbol of Anjou. He removed his gilded ceremonial helmet that identified him as royalty. He ordered Desh to put them on, to wear the king's own armor. It was a cold, calculated decision, born of pure survival instinct. Charles knew the Wallachian peasants were specifically hunting for the crown, for the symbol of their oppression. By dressing Desh in the unmistakable royal regalia, he created a human decoy, a target to draw all attention away from himself. Desh accepted the suicide mission without recorded hesitation, demonstrating the feudal loyalty that held medieval society together. He mounted a horse and rode deliberately out into the center of the kill zone, shouting commands in a loud voice, drawing every eye and every arrow to his position. He made himself the most visible target possible. The ruse worked with devastating, immediate efficiency. The Wallachian peasants, seeing the golden figure they had been told to hunt, abandoned their safe positions on the cliffs. They poured down into the ravine, like water breaking through a dam, carrying scythes, wooden clubs, and skinning knives. This wasn't a formal duel between armored knights following codes of chivalry. This was a mob execution, a lynching. They surrounded Desh completely, pulled him violently from his horse despite his attempts to fight. They did not offer him the chance to surrender or ransom himself, as was customary with captured nobility. They hacked him to pieces with farming tools, believing with absolute certainty they were ending the war by killing the tyrant who had insulted them. While his loyal friend was being literally butchered alive, screaming the king's name to maintain the deception, Charles slipped away through the chaos. Clad in a dirty leather tunic stolen from a dead foot soldier, smeared with mud and blood, blending perfectly with the terrified squires and common soldiers, the King of Hungary scrambled desperately toward the exit of the pass. He was accompanied by only a handful of guards who had stripped their identifying insignia. The hammer of the world, the man who had crushed oligarchs and centralized an empire, fled like a common thief in the night, abandoning his army to save himself. Behind him, the massacre reached its absolute zenith. With the king seemingly dead, with the golden ostrich crest captured and destroyed, the remaining Hungarian morale shattered into nothing. The will to resist evaporated. The Wallachians closed in systematically for the final kill. They moved among the trapped horses with long knives, methodically slashing hamstrings to bring the animals down. They pulled knights from their saddles and finished them efficiently on the ground where armor was less effective. The casualty list, when it was finally compiled, read like a directory of the Hungarian state's leadership. It wasn't just anonymous soldiers who died in that gorge. The High Chancellor of the kingdom became a casualty. The Voivode of Transylvania, a powerful noble, was killed. Numerous bishops and high clergy who had accompanied the crusade to bless the righteous slaughter of barbarians found that their prayers and holy robes offered absolutely no protection against Wallachian steel wielded in defense of home. The Chronicon Pictum describes the scene as a red harvest, the flower of Hungarian nobility systematically cut down not by their chivalrous peers in honorable combat, but by the very class of people they had deemed beneath contempt, beneath notice. By the fourth day, an eerie silence finally returned to the blood-soaked gorge. The screaming stopped. The last of the wounded died. The only sound remaining was the rushing water of the river at the bottom of the ravine, now running visibly black with diluted blood, carrying pieces of armor and bodies downstream. The ambush was absolute and total. Basarab had not just defeated the invading army tactically, he had effectively erased it from existence. Charles escaped with his physical life, but he left his honor, his reputation, his entire army, and the myth of Hungarian invincibility rotting in the mud of Posada. The return of Charles I to his palace at Visegrad was a ghostly procession that shocked the Hungarian court into silence. Of the 30,000 men who had marched out of Hungary just weeks before with banners waving and armor shining in the sun, with drums beating and confidence radiating, only a ragged few hundred stumbled back across the border. They brought no captured gold, no hostages, no glory or plunder. They brought only the horrifying story of a massacre, tales that seemed too brutal to believe. The king himself was a visibly broken man, showing signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. He had survived only through the grace of a disguise and the willing sacrifice of a loyal friend who died screaming in his place. The psychological blow to his self-image was immense and permanent. Charles had spent his entire adult reign, 25 years, carefully constructing a public image of absolute control, a divinely chosen monarch destined to tame the unruly East and bring civilization. In the mud of Posada, that carefully constructed image was shattered beyond repair. The hammer of the world had struck the anvil of the Carpathian Mountains with all his force and simply cracked. For Hungary as a state, the military defeat was a localized catastrophe, but not a fatal one to the kingdom's survival. The kingdom was fundamentally wealthy and resilient, with deep resources. Charles would eventually, over years, rebuild his military forces. He would continue to rule for another decade, guiding Hungary to economic prosperity through careful management, but he never, ever returned to Wallachia. The dream of incorporating the lands beyond the mountains into the Hungarian crown died permanently in that pass. The border was drawn in blood, and it would remain essentially fixed for generations. For Basarab, the immediate aftermath was transformative both personally and for his people. He did not chase the fleeing, broken Hungarians back into Transylvania seeking revenge. He did not attempt a counter-invasion to capture Hungarian territory. He understood, clearly and pragmatically, the limits of his own power. He commanded peasants and light infantry, not a conquering army. He had achieved his sole strategic objective: survival, continued independence. By destroying the royal host so completely, Basarab had achieved de facto independence from Hungarian overlordship. He was no longer a vassal to be summoned at will, or a shepherd to be mocked. He was the great voivode, a sovereign ruler who had successfully defended his realm against a superpower. The victory at Posada legitimized his rule in the eyes of his own people and, eventually and grudgingly, in the eyes of European diplomacy. This specific moment marks the true genesis of Wallachia as an independent state recognized by others. Before Posada, it was a collection of loose chiefdoms living under the shadow of foreign empires, barely acknowledged. After Posada, it was a country with defined borders and sovereignty. Basarab I is remembered in Romanian national mythology today, not just as a successful warrior, but with the epithet Intemiatorul Basarab, the founder, his dynasty, the House of Basarab, would rule Wallachia for centuries, producing descendants who would continue the established tradition of fierce resistance against impossible odds, including a certain Vlad III, later known as Vlad the Impaler. The relationship between the two states eventually normalized because politics is ultimately pragmatic. Years later, Basarab and Charles would even sign diplomatic treaties again, forced into cooperation by the rising existential threat of the Ottoman Empire, expanding northward. But the fundamental dynamic between them had shifted permanently. They spoke and negotiated as equals, or at least as distinct sovereign entities. The feudal chain of command was broken forever. Posada proved empirically that a small, determined nation, intelligently utilizing its geography and united under cunning leadership, could successfully defy an empire and survive. It was a brutal lesson that the Hungarian crown learned the hard way through blood. They stopped looking at the Carpathian Mountains as a convenient gateway to easy conquest and expansion. They started viewing them as a defensive wall they dared not attempt to climb again. Why did Posada happen? How does a ragged force of shepherds and peasants systematically dismantle the finest war machine of the 14th century, a professional army? To answer this fundamental question, we have to look past the romantic narrative of brave underdogs and examine the cold, hard mathematics of asymmetric warfare and the strategic mistakes that enabled it. Posada was not a historical anomaly or lucky accident. It was part of a brutal trend emerging across 14th century Europe, often called by military historians the Infantry Revolution. Just 15 years earlier, at the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, Swiss peasant militias used logs and halberds to ambush and completely slaughter Austrian knights in a narrow alpine pass through nearly identical tactics. Later, at Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen would use muddy terrain and superior range to destroy the cream of French nobility. The lesson emerging from these battles is remarkably consistent. Superior technology and expensive equipment do not automatically guarantee victory. Context and terrain do. Charles I brought a laser to a knife fight, but he found himself trapped in a room made entirely of mirrors that reflected his power back at him uselessly. He relied completely on heavy cavalry shock tactics, the dominant military doctrine of medieval Europe. This tactical approach depends entirely on momentum and psychological impact. A knight on a charging warhorse is essentially a kinetic projectile, capable of shattering infantry lines through sheer mass and the terror of the charge. But kinetic energy requires distance and space to build up speed. By deliberately luring the Hungarians into a narrow defile, Basarab robbed them of their engine, their source of power. A stationary knight, unable to charge, is just heavy, slow, and functionally blind inside his helmet. He is no longer a fearsome warrior, he is a turtle flipped helplessly on its back. Then consider the brutal economics of the killing. Medieval warfare is fundamentally an economic investment. Charles poured what amounted to a significant percentage of Hungary's entire GDP into this army. A single suit of Milanese plate armor cost what a peasant family might earn in 5 years. A properly trained warhorse required years of selective breeding and professional training. A knight needed a lifetime of practice starting from childhood. Enormous investment. Basarab's investment in his defensive strategy was essentially zero. The weapons used at Posada were rocks that cost nothing, gravity which is free, and timber that was abundantly available. The soldiers were peasants, whose only training consisted of a lifetime of living on mountains and knowing the terrain. In pure economic terms, Basarab achieved an effectively infinite return on investment. He traded free stones for priceless silver armor. He used the terrain itself as what military theorists call a force multiplier, allowing a single peasant to kill dozens of professional soldiers without ever drawing a sword or risking his life. But the true architect of the Hungarian defeat was not geography or economics. It was psychology, specifically command psychology. Military historians call this phenomenon command arrogance. Charles violated the fundamental rule articulated by Sun Tzu 2,000 years earlier. Know the terrain as well as you know yourself. He didn't just ignore or misunderstand the terrain. He actively despised it as beneath his concern. He was so fixated on the political narrative that he was the divinely appointed king and Basarab was a rebellious peasant that he forgot he was leading a biological organism, an army of human beings that needed food, water, rest, and maneuvering space to function. He committed what economists call the sunk cost fallacy on a catastrophic scale. Even when the food supplies ran completely out, even when the expensive horses were literally dying of starvation, he pushed forward deeper into hostile territory, because turning back felt psychologically like admitting defeat and weakness. When he finally did order the retreat, he chose the route that offered the least resistance to his ego, rather than the safest route for his army's survival. He assumed the Wallachians would be too frightened and respectful to attack a retreating lion, a king. He failed to realize that a wounded, starving lion is just meat to hungry wolves. Posada serves as a timeless case study in military incompetence, taught in academies today. It proves empirically that superior firepower and technology are completely meaningless if you cannot bring them to bear effectively on the enemy. It demonstrates that in the eternal rock, paper, scissors of warfare, a rock dropped from a high enough cliff will always defeat even the sharpest scissors. Today, if you travel through the remote regions of the southern Carpathian Mountains, the exact site of the massacre remains hidden and contested, reclaimed by ancient forests. Nature has absorbed and hidden the bones, the rusted iron, and the scattered silver marks. But the legacy of those 4 November days in 1330 is carved permanently into the political map of Europe. Basarab, I did not just win a single battle. He bought time, precious generations of time. By shattering the myth of Hungarian invincibility so completely, he secured a future for his people to develop independently. Wallachia would go on to survive for centuries in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth, wedged precariously between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the west and north, and later the aggressive Russian Tsars to the east. It survived these existential threats because it remembered and taught the fundamental lesson of Posada to every generation. Never fight the enemy's war on their terms. Always fight your own war. The House of Basarab became the literal spine of Romanian historical identity and resistance. His bloodline produced rulers who would continue to use asymmetric tactics and geographic advantages to defy giants, legendary men like Mircea the Elder and Vlad III, the Impaler. They were all students of the founder's example. They understood that when you are small and weak, survival is not about honor or following chivalric codes. It is about doing whatever is strategically necessary to make the cost of conquest too high for the invader to pay. For Charles I, Posada remained a permanent scar on what was otherwise a golden reign. He died a politically successful king, credited with bringing Hungary fully into the Renaissance and centralizing power. Yet multiple chronicles suggest he never fully recovered psychologically from the humiliation of fleeing in stolen rags, while his friends and nobles died for him, maintaining his deception. It serves as a permanent warning, carved into history for the powerful. Hubris is the most dangerous narcotic in human history. When leaders begin to believe their own propaganda uncritically, when they dismiss their rivals as shepherds or barbarians based on prejudice rather than capability, they are already walking blindly into the trap. We look back at the Battle of Posada not just as a violent clash of swords and politics, but as a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. It is fundamentally the story of how a desperate group of people, armed with rocks and righteous rage, stood up to the crushing weight of an empire and said clearly, no further. This is our land. It reminds us that history is not always written by the victors, as the saying claims. Sometimes it is written by the survivors, by those who refuse to disappear. The tactical brilliance of Posada echoes through military history, studied in war colleges as a perfect example of defensive asymmetric warfare. Modern military analysts compare it to Vietnam's jungle ambushes, to Afghanistan's mountain warfare, to any conflict where a technologically superior force is defeated by intimate knowledge of terrain and willingness to sacrifice. The Wallachian strategy combines several elements that military theorists now recognize as force multiplication: geographic channeling, forcing the enemy into kill zone; elevation advantage, high ground for gravity; weapons and archery; patience, waiting for the perfect moment rather than engaging prematurely; and most importantly, fighting a war of annihilation rather than honor. Basarab understood that he couldn't defeat Hungary in a war of attrition or multiple battles. He needed one perfect killing blow that would make future invasions politically impossible. The psychological impact on Hungary extended far beyond Charles I's personal trauma. An entire generation of Hungarian nobility was decimated in that pass. The political structure of the kingdom had to be rebuilt, with new families elevated to replace the dead. The loss of so many bishops and clergy created a vacuum in the church hierarchy. The economic cost of replacing 30,000 men's worth of armor, weapons, and horses was staggering, even for wealthy Hungary. Perhaps most significantly, the defeat shattered the psychological dominance Hungary had maintained over its neighbors. Other small states and principalities that had submitted to Hungarian pressure out of fear now saw that resistance was possible, that the empire could bleed. For Wallachia, the victory created a national founding myth that would be retold for centuries. Basarab became a legendary figure, his tactics studied and emulated by his successors. The battle established a template for Wallachian survival: avoid open battle, use the mountains, make invasion too costly. This strategy would be employed again and again. When the Ottomans later invaded, Wallachian voivodes, like Vlad the Impaler, would use similar scorched earth tactics and psychological warfare. The mountains that had destroyed Charles's army would claim many other invading forces over the centuries. The Carpathians became both shield and weapon, the defining geographic feature that allowed Romanian independence to survive being caught between empires. The cultural memory of Posada also shaped Romanian identity in profound ways. It taught that survival didn't require matching the enemy's strength, only exploiting their weaknesses. It validated asymmetric resistance against overwhelming odds. It created a narrative of the clever underdog defeating the arrogant empire that resonates in national consciousness even today. Folk songs and ballads about the battle were passed down through generations, each retelling emphasizing different aspects: Basarab's cunning, the peasants' courage, Charles's humiliation. These stories served both as historical memory and as instruction manual for future resistance. The battle also had immediate diplomatic consequences. Other European powers took notice of Hungary's catastrophic defeat. The prestige Charles had built up through decades of successful rule was severely damaged. His ability to project power and influence diplomatic negotiations was compromised. Neighboring states became less willing to automatically defer to Hungarian demands. The Pope in Avignon, who had supported Hungarian expansion as a bulwark against Orthodox and Muslim powers, had to reconsider the viability of relying on Hungarian military might. Basarab, meanwhile, gained international recognition he had never enjoyed before. He was no longer just a local warlord, he was the voivode who had defeated a king. This opened diplomatic channels and opportunities that had been closed to him. He could negotiate treaties as an equal, rather than begging for scraps. The victory gave him leverage to play different powers against each other, securing Wallachian independence through diplomacy backed by demonstrated military capability. The descendants of both men would continue their conflict in different forms. Charles's grandson, Louis the Great, would have a long and complex relationship with Wallachia, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile, but never again attempting the kind of total conquest his grandfather had envisioned. The House of Basarab would rule Wallachia until the 16th century, maintaining independence through the same combination of military resistance and clever diplomacy their founder had pioneered. The battle also represents a turning point in medieval warfare more broadly. Posada, along with Morgarten and later battles like Crécy and Agincourt, demonstrated that the age of cavalry dominance was ending. Infantry, when properly employed and positioned, could defeat mounted knights. This realization would gradually transform European warfare over the next century. The tactical lessons were clear. Terrain matters more than equipment. Defensive positions can overcome offensive power, and local knowledge is a decisive advantage. These principles would be rediscovered over and over throughout military history. Every guerrilla war, every successful defense by a weaker power, echoes the lessons of Posada. The battle teaches us that in warfare, as in life, arrogance and underestimation of one's opponent is often more fatal than lack of resources. Charles had every material advantage: wealth, numbers, equipment, training. He lost because he didn't respect his enemy, didn't understand the battlefield, and didn't adapt his tactics to the situation. Basarab had almost nothing but knowledge and patience. He won because he fought smart rather than proud. In the end, the Battle of Posada stands as one of history's great reversals, a moment when everything that should have guaranteed victory instead guaranteed defeat. It reminds us that power is context-dependent, that advantages in one situation become liabilities in another, and that human ingenuity and determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The image of peasants with rocks defeating armored knights captures something essential about resistance and survival. It tells us that the powerful are not invincible, that their strength has limits and weaknesses, and that those limits can be found and exploited by those desperate enough to look for them. 700 years later, we still tell this story because it offers hope. The hope that the weak are not doomed, that intelligence can overcome brute force, that survival is possible even when everything seems lost. The ghosts of those 30,000 Hungarian soldiers still haunt the Carpathian passes, a reminder of what happens when imperial ambition meets determined resistance on ground that favors the defender. Their deaths were not meaningless. They bought Wallachia centuries of independence and gave the world a lesson in the limits of military power. Charles, I learned too late that you cannot conquer people who would rather die than submit, especially when they control the terrain. Basarab taught future generations that survival sometimes requires making the cost of conquest unbearable, that you don't need to win every battle. You just need to make winning too expensive for your enemy to afford. If you survive this journey through the bloodiest mountain pass in medieval history with me, thank you for watching. These stories of forgotten battles help us understand both the fragility of power and the resilience of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Posada, please subscribe to Maproom Battles and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary exploring these pivotal moments. And here's a question for you to ponder and discuss in the comments. Was Charles I's catastrophic mistake simply personal arrogance and ethnic prejudice, or was he a victim of the inevitable historical shift from feudal cavalry-dominated warfare to something more modern and democratic? Was this battle a failure of one man, or the death cry of an entire military system? Let me know your thoughts below. The legacy of Posada extends into our modern world in unexpected ways. The battle is still taught in Romanian schools as a foundational moment in national history, the birth of sovereignty. Basarab's statue stands in multiple Romanian cities, celebrated as the founder who secured independence through cunning rather than matching force with force. The battle has inspired countless works of art, literature, and even film, each generation finding new meaning in the ancient story. For some, it's a tale of national pride and resistance. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the importance of respecting your enemy. For military historians, it's a case study in asymmetric warfare and the importance of terrain. All of these interpretations contain truth. The location itself, though disputed, has become a pilgrimage site for Romanian nationalists and history enthusiasts. Multiple locations claim to be the true site of the battle, each with local legends and folklore supporting their claim. Archaeological excavations have found medieval weapons and armor in several Carpathian passes, any of which could be evidence of the massacre. The ambiguity of the exact location has, in some ways, made the battle larger than life. It happened everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that haunts the entire mountain range. The strategic principles demonstrated at Posada remain relevant today. Modern military doctrine recognizes the same fundamental truths. Know your terrain. Force the enemy to fight on your terms. Exploit weaknesses rather than confronting strengths. And make the cost of victory higher than the value of the objective. These principles have been applied in countless modern conflicts, from the Vietnamese resistance to American power, to Afghan fighters defeating Soviet and NATO forces in mountain warfare, to every successful insurgency throughout history. The tools change, boulders become IEDs, arrows become rifles, but the underlying strategy remains constant. The psychological dimension of warfare that Posada illustrates so clearly is also still relevant. Charles's ethnic prejudice and contempt for his enemy literally killed him and his army. The assumption that civilized forces are inherently superior to barbarian ones has led to countless military disasters throughout history. The British Empire learned this lesson in Afghanistan. The Americans relearned it in Vietnam. Every empire that has ever existed has at some point underestimated an enemy they considered inferior and paid a terrible price. Posada is the medieval version of this eternal pattern. In the end, we remember Posada not because of its scale, there were larger battles with higher body counts, but because of what it represents. It represents the victory of the weak over the strong, of knowledge over power, of patience over aggression, of the local over the imperial. It reminds us that no empire is invincible, no military advantage is absolute, and no victory is guaranteed. Most importantly, it teaches that survival is possible even against impossible odds if you're willing to fight smart, to use every advantage, no matter how small, and to never, ever give up. The Battle of Posada stands as eternal testimony that empires fall not just from external enemies, but from their own arrogance, that victory requires respecting your opponent, and that the human capacity for resistance can never be fully suppressed. The mountains remember what the Chronicles might forget, that on those 4 November days in 1330, shepherds became warriors, and an empire learned humility. Check out this next video on the screen to explore another moment when geography and determination changed the course of history, when the underdog rewrote the rules of power. I'll see you there.